The evening had settled in quietly over my home in Houston. The hum of the air conditioner mingled with the distant sounds of children playing down the street and the occasional honk of a car in the neighborhood. I had just put down my knitting, a simple pattern I'd been working on, and settled into the armchair by the window with a cup of chamomile tea. Retirement had offered me calm mornings and long afternoons of reflection, yet the stillness tonight felt heavier somehow. I had grown accustomed to the rhythms of life after decades of balancing work and raising my daughter alone, but moments like this, the quiet before anything happens, always left me uneasy. The phone rang, piercing the calm, and I hesitated, my hand hovering over it as if I could will it away. A small knot of apprehension formed in my chest. With a slow inhale, I answered, "Hello?" "Don't bother us, we need space." My daughter's voice cut through the line, sharp and authoritative. The words sank deep, twisting my stomach into knots. I froze, unable to respond at first, feeling a cold weight settle over my chest. I remembered all those late nights when I had stayed up waiting for her to come home, the birthdays spent making meals she barely noticed, the sacrifices I'd quietly shouldered to give her a life I thought she would cherish. Had I done too much or too little? Was my love too clumsy, too visible, or perhaps too absent? My mind raced, sifting through every moment that might have led her to push me away so decisively. I sank back into the chair, my hands trembling slightly as I held the receiver, replaying the call over and over in my head. Every syllable from her voice lingered, echoing with an unexpected coldness that I had never heard before. Memories of raising her alone, the late-night feedings, the school projects completed by candlelight, the countless hours working overtime just to keep a roof over our heads, flooded back, and with them came the sorrow of being unseen. It was a familiar ache, one I had brushed aside for years, yet tonight it felt heavier, sharper. I noticed the worn-out family photo on the mantel, its frame chipped and faded. My fingers brushed against it almost absent-mindedly, drawing me into a quiet reflection of the years gone by. The photo seemed to mirror my own feelings, steadfast, holding the weight of memories, quietly bearing witness to all that had been given and unacknowledged. The text that had preceded the call, the seemingly innocent message I sent to check on her, now seemed to take on a life of its own, a trigger that had unleashed this curt dismissal. Anger and doubt mingled. Was I overreacting, or had her words cut as deep as they felt? I tried to rationalize, seeking understanding rather than succumbing to immediate indignation. Images of smaller conflicts, moments of distance and coldness that I had brushed aside, came into sharp focus. Had I misread her cues all along? Were we speaking different languages of love and care, separated not just by age, but by the unspoken expectations that had grown between us? I felt the familiar sting of invisibility, that quiet sense of being overlooked even by those I had devoted my life to raising. Yet, amidst the confusion, a seed of resolve began to grow, subtle but persistent. I reached for my phone again, this time to text a close friend. Their voice had always been a sounding board, a source of clarity and reassurance. After reading my message, the reply came swiftly. "You've given so much. Now it's their turn to see you." Those words warmed me, offering both validation and gentle encouragement. I weighed my options carefully, to ignore, to confront, or to plan. Pride, love, and the desire for acknowledgement battled silently within me. Across the room, the shadows of evening seemed to stretch longer, and I noticed small, almost imperceptible slights from other family members that had occurred earlier in the day, reinforcing the pattern I had long sensed. By the time the house had grown darker, I had begun cataloging in my mind all the incidents where my contributions had been dismissed, the moments of invisibility that had accumulated into this present confrontation. Notes, screenshots, small reminders of my care and involvement. They were mental bookmarks, quietly lining the path for a response that would not be impulsive, but calculated. I whispered to myself, "Silence now, strength later," the mantra echoing softly against the walls of my living room. I glanced back at the family photo once more, fingers tracing the familiar edges of the frame. My resolve hardened, tempered by years of experience and tempered pride. "You won't get away with this," I thought. "Not now, not ever." The evening air settled around me, carrying with it the weight of both hurt and determination. My plan was forming, quiet and deliberate, ready to unfold at the precise moment that would maximize impact. Morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long stripes across the kitchen floor. I sat at the table, sipping coffee, staring into the dark depths of the mug as if it could reveal answers I wasn't ready to face. The words from last night's call replayed over and over in my mind. "Don't bother us. We need space." Each repetition tightened the knot in my chest, but it also sharpened my awareness. The house was silent, too silent, and that emptiness amplified the ache of being unseen. I ran my hand along the worn edge of the table, thinking of every sacrifice, every late night, every missed gathering, all to give my daughter a life I hoped she would value. As I listened to the subtle sounds of the neighborhood waking up, I began noticing small patterns, little changes that I hadn't paid attention to before. The neighbor across the street had exchanged a brief, knowing glance with my cousin yesterday. The aunt who used to call weekly had gone silent for months. These small shifts, barely perceptible, felt like breadcrumbs leading me to understand the larger story I had been blind to for so long. I remembered moments when subtle dismissals had occurred, her eye rolls, curt answers, little shrugs, and realized that they were pieces of a growing distance, a repeated pattern that now demanded my attention. I moved slowly, letting my eyes wander over familiar corners of the house. Each photograph, each trinket, seemed to whisper reminders of times I had poured myself into family life, only to be overlooked or undervalued. The old family keepsake, a brass locket, sat on the shelf catching the morning light. I picked it up, feeling its weight, thinking of all the moments it had silently observed. The laughter, the tears, the quiet endurance. This small ritual anchored me, grounding my growing resolve. I was hurt, yes, but the hurt was no longer a call to surrender. It was a prompt to observe, to learn, and to plan. The more I watched, the more subtle signs appeared. In conversations with neighbors, I caught whispers I hadn't noticed before, tiny mentions of gatherings I hadn't been invited to, little references that hinted at partial truths or overlooked tensions. Even the mail, the small flurry of bills and letters, revealed hints, notes that indicated plans my daughter had kept from me, invitations that had been quietly ignored. Each observation built a mosaic of understanding. The distance wasn't random, it was deliberate, a subtle assertion of independence I hadn't anticipated. By mid-morning, I found myself scribbling notes in a small journal I kept tucked in the corner of the kitchen counter. Names, dates, interactions, all cataloged without judgment, simply as evidence. The frustration that had been swelling began to intertwine with a quiet sense of empowerment. I realized that by paying attention, by observing without immediate reaction, I was reclaiming agency over a situation that had felt uncontrollable. My mind moved methodically, noting inconsistencies, weighing alliances, and considering the influence each family member held within the larger dynamic. Yet as the sun climbed higher, a flicker of doubt crept in. Was I overstepping? Was this vigilance ethical? Or was I becoming what I had always tried to avoid, suspicious and resentful? I paused, inhaling deeply, reminding myself of the mantra I had whispered the night before. Patience now ensures strength later. Every decision, every action needed careful timing. My role was not to react impulsively, but to observe, to gather, to prepare. The stakes were higher than momentary frustration. This was about reclaiming respect and presence in a family that had begun to overlook me. By late morning, the neighborhood buzz had grown louder, but I moved through it with deliberate awareness. And a cousin walking past glanced my way, a barely perceptible smirk crossing his face, and I noted it in my journal. Little acknowledgments, small shifts, these were the first pieces of a broader understanding. And then, as I checked my phone again, a message from a distant relative arrived, casual in tone, but heavy in implication. A subtle betrayal revealed itself in the way family communications were being curated, confirming suspicions I hadn't dared articulate before. My jaw tightened, but my heart steadied. This was not the time for confrontation. This was the moment for careful planning. I placed the phone down and looked around the room, eyes resting on the journal, the brass locket, the photographs, each one a reminder of endurance, of intelligence, of love given without guarantee of acknowledgement. My mind mapped out the threads of influence, of preference, of avoidance. Every small clue, every subtle slight, had its place in the pattern I was beginning to see clearly. Today, observation was the weapon, strategy was the path, and somewhere in the layers of mundane interactions and quiet betrayals, I had found the first sparks of hope and a determination that would guide my next moves. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the driveway as I parked in front of my daughter's house. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with unspoken tension. As I stepped onto the porch, I noticed the deliberate stiffness in her greeting, the polite but distant smiles from her friends, and the subtle avoidance of eye contact from her siblings. I paused at the threshold, taking a slow breath to steady my pulse. I had expected friction, but the quiet intensity of it now caught me off guard, forcing me to adjust my approach before stepping inside. Once inside, the atmosphere of the house made every step feel measured. There were polite words, small talk about the weather and neighborhood updates, but beneath it all ran currents I had learned to read over the years. A cousin's comment about my retired status, carefully framed as harmless, was laced with condescension, and I caught the knowing glance exchanged with another relative. They didn't even realize they were revealing their own unspoken judgments. I reminded myself to stay calm, to let the room reveal its secrets without giving away my own intentions. The conversation flowed, tight and clipped, and I began noticing more subtle power dynamics. My daughter, sitting at the center, made a casually cutting remark about my suggestions for family activities, framing it as if I were out of touch. Laughter rippled through the room, polite but slightly forced. I felt the familiar prickle of frustration rise, yet I held myself together, answering each comment with measured words that carried more weight than they knew. Then, unexpectedly, an uncle, meant to be neutral, let slip a remark about old grievances, an unintentional revelation of resentment that had been simmering just below the surface. My eyes narrowed slightly, the pieces of a long-hidden family hierarchy coming into focus. I moved through the gathering carefully, engaging when necessary, but never overextending. I noted inconsistencies in stories about events, little contradictions that pointed to hidden agendas and minor betrayals. A subtle snub during lunch, a misremembered anecdote, a whispered aside overheard while pretending to stretch. Each clue reinforced what I had suspected. Some in the family were trying to manipulate perception, to control narratives, to assert authority quietly. The more I observed, the more empowered I felt. I understood now that patience, paired with discernment, was a form of power in itself. As I reflected internally, balancing hurt with resolve, I questioned my limits. How much could I tolerate before intervention became necessary? I recalled nights spent worrying over conflicts I thought were resolved, sacrifices I had made to nurture relationships, and moments when my voice had been drowned out by louder, more assertive family members. Yet, in that same reflection, I found clarity. My presence mattered. My intelligence mattered. My influence could still be felt if wielded carefully, strategically, and without unnecessary display of anger. By the time the sun began to dip behind the rooftops, I had mapped the room in my mind. I knew who would side with whom in subtle skirmishes, who would be swayed by quiet reasoning, and who would respond only to visible strength. My journal, tucked in my bag, waited for tonight's notes, a record of observations and small victories, a blueprint for future action. I felt a cautious satisfaction in understanding the terrain before stepping further, recognizing that the first confrontation didn't need to be explosive, it needed to be deliberate. I lingered for a moment near the hallway mirror, catching my reflection. There was no outward sign of the careful calculations racing through my mind, just a calm, steady gaze that belied the alertness beneath. The family would test me in ways I had yet to predict, but I was ready. Each word, each glance, each understated response was part of a silent strategy, a reclaiming of agency in a space that had, for too long, minimized my voice. And in that quiet observation, I found not only knowledge, but also a renewed sense of authority. I was present, aware, and poised. Evening settled over Houston, casting the kitchen in a soft amber glow. I leaned against the counter, quietly observing the subtle chaos of a family gathering that felt anything but warm. My daughter moved with practiced grace, her voice light but edged with an unmistakable authority that left little room for me. The air was thick with familiar dynamics, polite smiles masking judgment, casual comments carrying hidden critiques. I felt the familiar tug of frustration, but this time I recognized it as a signal, a moment demanding clear boundaries. I spoke up gently, inserting my perspective into the conversation with measured clarity. "I think we should consider everyone's schedule before planning," I said, making sure my tone conveyed reason, not resentment. Eyes flickered toward me, some polite, some wary. I could feel the subtle resistance from my daughter, the quiet attempts by others to sideline my input. Yet, I remained composed, aware that every word I chose was a statement of my presence and intellect. A small, previously unnoticed manipulation surfaced in the exchange, a slight omission about a family decision. I noted it mentally, understanding that this was part of a broader pattern I could leverage strategically. As the evening unfolded, I continued observing, noting inconsistencies and opportunities. An overconfident cousin spoke in sweeping statements about our family's future, unknowingly exposing gaps I could later address. I identified sympathetic nods, quiet glances from those who understood, and even subtle reassurances from old friends present. A slip in the narrative, a hidden vulnerability revealed in passing, felt like a small victory. It reminded me that influence often comes from careful timing and calculated moves rather than overt confrontation. I felt a growing sense of empowerment, a quiet assertion of the control I had always held but rarely exercised. I allowed myself a reflective pause, considering the weight of years spent nurturing family relationships, the sacrifices made, the emotional labor often overlooked. How much more could I endure before I demanded recognition? I reconciled the need for action with my commitment to dignity. Patience had its place, but tonight, measured intervention was appropriate. I rehearsed in my mind responses that balanced firmness with empathy, allowing my voice to assert authority without alienating potential allies. My identity, my worth, were non-negotiable, and I would navigate these waters with a deliberate, strategic hand. By the end of the evening, the contours of a plan had begun to form. I recognized early signs of escalation, subtle jabs, quiet exclusions, and passive-aggressive behavior, but I was no longer passive. Each observation, each carefully timed comment, and each mental note was part of a larger strategy. A symbolic object on the counter, a family memento I touched absent-mindedly, anchored my resolve. I knew that the coming days would require precision, timing, and patience, but I was ready. I could no longer remain invisible, and how I chose to assert myself would shape the path forward. The quiet rebellion had begun, deliberate, calculated, and unyielding. The living room was thick with quiet tension when I arrived that late afternoon. The usual chatter of relatives was subdued, almost guarded, as if they all sensed the subtle shift in my demeanor. I settled into a chair, letting my gaze roam over familiar faces, noticing small, almost imperceptible gestures, the tightened jaw of my daughter, the sidelong glances from cousins, the polite avoidance from a niece who had always seemed eager to impress. I felt the weight of recurring undermining, the familiar pattern of exclusion that had marked so many family gatherings, pressing against my resolve. But this time, I was ready. My mind cataloged each slight, each manipulative glance, preparing for measured confrontation. I reminded myself, dignity first, emotion controlled, strategy at the forefront. As the conversation unfolded, I found my moment. Politely but with firm clarity, I addressed a comment that carried an edge meant to dismiss me. "I understand your point, but I think there's another perspective we should consider," I said, letting my tone carry the weight of calm authority. Faces turned toward me, some startled, some defensive. The small revelations began to surface. A cousin had quietly attempted to shift blame for a minor family oversight onto me, revealing hidden agendas I had long suspected. I smiled subtly, using a touch of wit to diffuse tension while asserting my presence. Every sentence was a marker of self-worth, a quiet stand against years of being overlooked. I continued observing, noting inconsistencies in stories and behaviors. My daughter's confident statements occasionally faltered, exposing gaps I could leverage later. I recognized allies through nods and glances that spoke volumes, quiet supporters who understood the balance of respect and patience. A minor betrayal became apparent in a conversation about family finances. Someone had withheld information, assuming it would go unnoticed. I filed it away mentally, understanding that this knowledge gave me influence I had yet to exercise. The room seemed charged now, a network of subtle power plays where observation mattered as much as speaking out. Reflection settled over me as I considered my own values and the moral compass guiding my actions. Assertiveness was necessary, yes, but so was integrity. I could not let anger dictate responses, yet I would not shrink from asserting boundaries. The years of emotional labor, sacrifices, and overlooked contributions grounded me, reminding me that dignity was my shield and strategy my sword. I balanced emotion with calculation, ensuring each reaction reinforced my authority while preserving relationships where possible. Patience and timing remained crucial, and I measured each potential move with care. By the end of the gathering, a sense of empowerment had replaced the earlier tension. I had spoken, been heard, and gathered insight into the family's undercurrents. Subtle cues hinted at upcoming challenges, but I now saw them as opportunities rather than threats. The room held its quiet rhythm, but I had changed the balance. My presence was no longer invisible, my voice no longer easily overlooked. I had planted the seeds of my stand. Now, I would see if they would bloom or wither. The dining room felt smaller than usual that evening, the air taut with unspoken expectations. I took my seat at the table, sensing the simmering tension radiating from my daughter and the extended family around us. Their dismissive comments had already begun, subtle jabs wrapped in polite tones, each one testing my patience. I reminded myself to stay composed. I had faced this before, but tonight I would not shrink. My mind catalogued their words, their glances, the faint smirks, every gesture noted for later reflection and strategic response. Frustration laced my chest, yet I breathed slowly, focusing on measured control, letting my awareness sharpen to the underlying power dynamics at play. When the conversation took a pointed turn, I responded directly, my tone calm but unmistakably firm. "I've noticed certain patterns, and I think it's important we address them openly," I said, drawing eyes toward me. I laid out examples of subtle exclusions and manipulations, each detail precise, each accusation tempered with dignity. The room shifted slightly. Some faces flushed, others stiffened, but my resolve remained steady. This was the moment to assert clarity without aggression, to show that knowledge and composure were as potent as raised voices. Humor slipped in gently, a light deflection to maintain control over the emotional temperature, yet beneath it, my point landed with unmistakable authority. The small tremors of surprise from my daughter confirmed that my presence could no longer be dismissed. I continued to watch, noting the inconsistencies in stories, the little gaps where truth was bent or hidden. A cousin's casual comment revealed a previously unnoticed intention to sway outcomes behind my back. I filed this mentally, aware that each small revelation was a stepping stone toward reclaiming influence. Allies became apparent in subtle nods and tentative smiles, a quiet network forming within the gathering. My mind worked swiftly, mapping out possibilities, planning how these threads could be woven into an advantage. With each observation, I felt the subtle empowerment that came from understanding the terrain before making a decisive move. Between measured exchanges, I reflected on my values and personal integrity. Anger tried to surface, but I tempered it with strategy, knowing that impulsive reactions could erode the respect I was determined to reclaim. My sense of self-worth anchored every word, every glance, every choice. Patience was still vital, but patience informed by observation and insight, not resignation. I imagined the conversations yet to come, rehearsed my responses in quiet reflection, and strengthened my internal resolve. Each minor victory, acknowledged through body language, tone, or subtle compliance, fed my confidence and reinforced the power of deliberate action. As the evening wore on, the tension at the table grew almost tangible. I sensed the family's collective anticipation of what my next move might be. Subtle cues, shifts in posture, fleeting expressions, hinted at upcoming challenges, perhaps even attempts to test my authority. Yet I remained poised, ready to respond not with impulse, but with precision. The knowledge I had gathered, the insights I had observed, all pointed toward a pivotal moment on the horizon. I could feel it approaching, a moment where I would assert my voice decisively and reclaim the respect that had long been overlooked. I was ready, my mind sharp, my purpose clear, and my resolve unwavering. The afternoon light slanted through the living room blinds, casting long, narrow shadows across the furniture. I sat quietly, tracing the familiar lines of the carpet, replaying the confrontations of the past weeks in my mind. Each slight, each dismissive word, each subtle undermining had left an imprint, but tonight, clarity began to settle in. I could see the patterns, how they maneuvered to maintain control, how they expected me to shrink and let their subtle manipulations slide. And then, as if a veil lifted, I noticed the overlooked detail that explained so much. A sequence of small actions, easily dismissed, that revealed the true undercurrent of their intentions. Suddenly, the scattered frustrations I had carried turned into a quiet, cautious optimism. I realized I held more influence than I had acknowledged, and that with strategy, I could shift the balance. I rose, moving deliberately toward the study, my thoughts sharpening with purpose. Every choice I made, every word I would say, had to be measured, firm, yet inviting compliance from potential allies. I considered the family members who might support me quietly, the subtle leverage I had gathered from my careful observations. There was a delicate balance, assert boundaries without alienating those whose loyalty or neutrality could tip the scales in my favor. I rehearsed phrases silently, testing their impact, weighing the tone, the cadence, the confidence each carried. Every detail mattered. Timing mattered. The room around me seemed to pulse with anticipation, a tangible tension I could almost harness. When I returned to the living room, the atmosphere had shifted slightly. The family, unaware of the mental preparations taking place just down the hall, continued their chatter, unaware of the keen attention behind my eyes. I engaged selectively, asking pointed questions and observing the reactions, each answer revealing vulnerabilities and inconsistencies. A cousin's offhand remark, a fleeting glance from my daughter, all fed into the mental map I was constructing. I recognized their insecurities now, the thin cracks in the facades they presented. I noted every alliance, every hesitant nod, every hesitation in speech, calculating how to use these for leverage in upcoming exchanges. The room felt like a chessboard, and I was ready to play strategically. As I spoke, I maintained a calm exterior, letting wit and logic guide my words rather than emotion. They expected tension, confrontation, perhaps tears, but I offered clarity instead. Each observation, each carefully chosen phrase, fortified my position. I felt a rising confidence, the kind that comes from understanding not just what others are doing, but why. I could predict their reactions, anticipate their defenses, and prepare responses that would maintain both my dignity and authority. This was no longer just about asserting myself. It was about reclaiming the respect that had long been deferred, about establishing presence in a family dynamic that had historically overlooked me. By evening, I sat back in my chair, taking in the subtle changes around the room. Eyes that once skirted mine now met with a tentative acknowledgement. Smiles were softer, gestures less dismissive. I felt the undercurrent of power shifting, and with it, a sense of internal victory. My reflection turned inward as I measured my own growth. The patience, the discipline, the strategic clarity that had been building over weeks now converged into a focused force. I could see the moment approaching when a decisive, public assertion would claim the respect long withheld. I felt it in the tension, in the careful avoidance of eye contact, in the subtle, uneasy movements around the room. Everything pointed toward a critical juncture that I would meet with measured authority. I let the room settle into a quiet lull, my gaze lingering on the study doorway. I knew the next step had to be deliberate, precise, and unassailable. The foundation was laid, the pieces arranged. All that remained was the act, the moment when control could finally be reclaimed, and the family would recognize, beyond doubt, the presence and power I carried. A shift had begun, and I felt it deep in my chest, steady, sure, unstoppable. Tonight, the turning point had arrived. The house was alive with the chatter of relatives gathering for the evening, yet I moved through it like a calm tide, observing and calculating. Every glance, every half-smile, every hushed comment was noted and filed in my mind. I had spent days preparing, reviewing every slight, every past grievance, weighing my words, rehearsing my stance. I entered the room deliberately, chest lifted, shoulders relaxed, eyes scanning. There was no hesitation. I made my presence known, not loudly, not theatrically, but unmistakably. My authority was quiet but absolute, felt by those who had been attempting to diminish me for years. As conversations swirled around the room, I chose my moment carefully. A relative made an offhand remark that echoed a past injustice, an old favoritism that had gone unchecked. I allowed the comment to hang for a heartbeat before addressing it, voice steady, controlled. I pointed out the pattern without accusation, simply laying facts in plain sight, demonstrating awareness that could no longer be ignored. Eyes widened, subtle shifts in posture revealed discomfort, and a murmur ran through the circle. The moment was mine. I felt the weight of long-neglected respect settling back where it belonged. Families are complex, and power rarely yields easily. My words had established a presence, but I was prepared for the pushback. A cousin tried a subtle retort, attempting to reassert old hierarchies, but I had anticipated this. Calmly, I responded with precise examples, evidence of contributions and sacrifices long overlooked, weaving logic and emotional clarity. The room quieted as they listened, realizing the authority I carried was deliberate, not reactive. My daughter's eyes flickered, surprise, hesitation, and I saw the vulnerability I had been mapping for weeks. This was no longer about quiet endurance. It was a strategic reclamation. I paced my engagement carefully, reinforcing each point with patience. I acknowledged minor concessions, subtly inviting cooperation from potential allies while exposing weaknesses without malice. The power dynamics shifted subtly. Respect, once withheld, began to show itself in posture, tone, and attention. I felt satisfaction, not triumph over others, but validation of my presence, my voice, my rights. I did not shout. I did not storm. I led with intelligence, composure, and unwavering self-worth. Then, as expected, an unexpected challenge arose. A previously quiet family member made a sharp remark intended to destabilize, but I met it with a steady gaze and a controlled, reasoned response. The room held its breath. In that moment, every preparation, every observation, every carefully rehearsed phrase converged. I had the upper hand because my power was rooted in clarity, strategy, and calm authority. I turned the attempted challenge into an opportunity to reinforce my position, subtly demonstrating the strength I carried without arrogance. By the evening's close, the atmosphere had changed. The room carried a new energy, a recognition that I could not be ignored, that my voice had weight and consequence. The groundwork for final resolution had been laid, and I felt the surge of empowerment that comes from reclaiming agency long deferred. The stage was set. I could see the decisive actions required, the moment when authority and respect would be fully affirmed. The night was far from over, but finally, I felt the power returning to where it belonged. The house had finally quieted, the echoes of confrontation lingering in the air, but softened by a sense of equilibrium. I sat back in the familiar chair, hands folded, eyes tracing the subtle gestures around the room. My family's expressions had shifted, some tentative, some reluctantly respectful, but all carried acknowledgement I had long awaited. A cousin, who often skirted responsibilities and dismissed contributions, offered a quiet, almost sheepish, "I see now. Thank you." It was a small gesture, a minor apology, but it carried weight beyond words. I allowed myself a brief internal nod of satisfaction. The balance of power had begun to settle, and I had reclaimed my voice without resorting to anger or humiliation. Alone later that evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The lingering frustrations, the quiet observations, the carefully plotted maneuvers, they had all shaped a resilience I had once doubted. I revisited the memory of that first call, the seed of invisibility, the echoes of rejection. But now, the room felt lighter, as if the air itself carried the validation I had been denied. My thoughts returned to the keepsake photo I had clutched during moments of doubt. It had been more than a picture. It was a symbol of the strength, love, and patience that had guided me. Its presence now seemed almost celebratory, a quiet echo of empowerment fulfilled. I began setting the mental boundaries for the future, a blueprint for interactions that would protect both my dignity and my emotional space. I could participate without sacrificing my worth, speak without fear of dismissal, and extend patience without tolerating manipulation. I mapped subtle strategies for remaining connected while ensuring respect was non-negotiable. Small practical steps emerged naturally, clarifying expectations, asserting time and space, and gently correcting misunderstandings before they could gain traction. And independence, both emotional and practical, was no longer a concept but a lived experience, reinforced with intention and foresight. Later, in the company of those willing to support and honor the balance we had reached, acknowledgement became tangible. A niece, who had often overlooked my advice, expressed gratitude for guidance I had provided in managing family matters. A symbolic gesture, the passing of a family heirloom into my care, reinforced the recognition of my contributions and authority. There was no triumph in dominance, only satisfaction in fairness restored. Emotional closure did not demand apologies from all, only an honest acknowledgement from those prepared to see me as I always had been, capable, deserving, and resolute. The lessons of patience, strategy, and quiet assertion had reached fruition. As night deepened, I sat alone once more, reflecting on the journey from invisibility to authority. The confrontation had been necessary, but it was the wisdom and measured response that yielded lasting respect. I knew there remained nuances to navigate, subtle challenges that life and family would always present, yet the foundation was firm. I was empowered, self-assured, and clear on the value of my presence. I had moved beyond past hurts, and while the future might still hold moments of friction, I was equipped to meet them with strategy, calm, and dignity. The story of reclamation had reached its current resolution, leaving me poised, reflective, and ready for the life that lay ahead.